Finally, we will hear from Dr. Urszula Górska-Klimowska, a neuroscientist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, whose research investigates the neural mechanism of consciousness, particularly in patients with epilepsy and disorders of consciousness. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Urszula Górska-Klimowska.
Okay, so first of all, I would like to thank for this invitation, and I'm really grateful to be able to speak to you today and like to meet everyone from the Polonium Foundation. That's really a great pleasure. I hope I will stay in touch. And today I would like to speak a little more about my niche, which is trying to find neuronal correlates of consciousness on the clinical population. Okay, so how do we define consciousness? Well, actually, there are multiple answers to this question. So like the search for neuronal correlates of consciousness, so like the minimal set of neuronal events jointly sufficient for that state, led us to development of multiple concepts, which were kind of like developed in parallel. So we were having today this great talk about communication, and actually when I was thinking about this here, I seen it like as a bubbles, like separate bubbles living in their own worlds, trying to investigate consciousness. But well, this led us to the point when actually to move forward in the field, we needed to start comparing them. And that was the mission of adversarial collaboration. First of adversarial collaboration was actually the Cogitate one, which tried to compare between global neuronal global neuronal workspace theory and integrated information theory. And if you know a little bit, okay, maybe let's go here. If you know a little bit about those two, they are like really defining consciousness even in different way. And like one is speaking about like coming from brain, taking like definitions from and research from psychology. The other is like defining consciousness from intrinsic perspective, defining like axioms, postulates. They speak in different languages. But Cogitate tried to bring them together to the common space, which is brain, and like check how they will answer if they are tested with the same experiment. And just shortly that you know, a global neuronal workspace posits that consciousness arises from global broadcasting of information through interconnected distributed network where prefrontal cortex is important. And ignition, so like late amplification of this information occurs within this network. And on the contrary, IIT would say that no, consciousness is a structure. It's not a message to be passed by. And it's specified intrinsically by integrated cause and effect structures of regions with specific, like with the pyramids of grids architecture. And that's why primary localize in posterior area. So Cogitate initialized the dialogue between theory leaders and make them cannot move really, and make them identify predictions, which actually already was a huge achievement of this consortium. And they defined like two experiments which were based on vision as like the most common modality, and the experiments, like the analysis and interpretation of the results was predefined. And it was a lot of collaborative work with like 7 different laboratories in the world, theory independent, performing those experiments. And that led to large sample. There was like built-in replication done on 2/3 of data. I did not mention it was done on MEG, IEG, and fMRI. And later, those needed to be integrated. We shared the data with the community, and of course, it led to some challenges of the theories. And I would like to tell a little bit more about experiment 1 only today. Like There are two reasons. First of all, because it was already published. Experiment 2, not yet, so I cannot really speak about the results. And also because it was kind of different from what's normally done in like this field. So like classically, when we study neuronal correlates of consciousness, we use, for example, like seen versus unseen contrast. But then for the neuronal correlates, we are actually unsure if what we measure is only consciousness or also the prerequisites, so like what we believe, what we expect, or also like consequences. So to avoid it, with experiment 1, we use clearly visible stimuli, fully attended with long durations, in the center of the screen with high contrast and presented in isolation. And I would like to show you how this experiment looked like. It was a very simple one. So like you were having like to target specific face and object, and then here you can see the target. When we move on, there's another object which become task relevant because it's like from the same category. And then, okay, we have another target, another task relevant stimuli, and we have also different categories which become task irrelevant. And we were interested about the contrast between task irrelevant and task relevant targets were taken out. And here are the people that mainly contributed to that part. Okay, and it is like barely impossible to like introduce you with the whole results in one slide, but actually I'm trying to do so. For prediction 1, we tested where in the brain the category of the stimuli can be decoded from, revealing for both contrasts, like for task relevant to irrelevant and, I forgot, and for task irrelevant to relevant, pointing into both prefrontal and posterior areas. But when we took only orientation, which was actually all the time always task irrelevant feature, it pointed out to only posterior areas, suggesting more into what IIT predicted. For prediction 2, we tested for how long the specific content of consciousness is actively maintained. And that's what the theory predicted. So like here is like the picture that I made for like what they predicted, and now we can see how it like looked in real. So for task relevant stimuli, it was close to IIT, let's say, and like for GNW close to the onset, but it also predicted the offset response, which was never present. When we moved to like object identity, it was almost nothing, and like nothing for orientation of the stimuli, which actually challenged both theories here a little bit. And the final challenge was actually prediction 3, when we tested like the interareal communication, and here actually none of the predictions were met regarding like frequencies or like specific areas that the theories wanted, which actually show how difficult this experiment was, but also like despite huge progress that this experiment gave us, also how much still needs to be done. Okay, so those are the people who mainly contributed to this part, and now I think you now will understand more why instead of like answering the question how we define consciousness, I prefer in my talk to use like the consciousness disclosure and say how I understand consciousness. And here I would take consciousness as subjective experience. And it goes from IIT. I am actually from IIT lab, so it's not surprising. Saying that from the intrinsic perspective of a subject, what is it like to hear, feel, or have a thought? Or what's lost in dreamless sleep when from our own intrinsic perspective, everything disappears? And when we take it to like the clinical setting, what is important to add to this disclosure is that it is something which is independent of behavioral responsiveness. Moreover, it's independent of external connectedness. What I mean by this, you can imagine dreaming. You are disconnected from environment, yet you're still conscious. It's also independent from metacognitive competence. And here you can imagine, for example, ketamine anesthesia, where prefrontal cortex is largely suppressed, but well, experience is still very vivid. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I study consciousness in clinical context. So here you already got familiar with Terry Chavot and with this space of global states of consciousness with awareness and arousal. And I can place here states following severe brain injuries and further coma. Patients end up in the states, for example, unresponsive wakefulness syndrome, where it's defined as the patient being unconscious, and minimally conscious state with inconsistent but reproducible signs of awareness. But what is striking, that still 40% of UWS patients with better behavior tool, with better neuroimaging tool, can be found actually conscious. So there is a high misdiagnosis rate. And it actually led to even new diagnostic category, which is cognitive motor dissociation for the patients who doesn't show any behavioral signs, but they respond to neuroimaging, similar also locked-in syndrome. So all tools of clinical diagnosis are actually based on behavior. There are some better, some worse. The simplest and used in ICU is Glasgow Coma Scale. There's also 4 scale, which is kind of good for locked-in syndrome. And the gold standard is coma recovery state revised, which is designed for the subtle behavioral differences between UWS and MCS. But we need to keep in mind that even with the best behavioral tool, absence of behavioral responsiveness does not imply absence of consciousness. And these DOC patients largely fluctuate, so we need multiple measurements. Some may not have capacity for movement, and some may react to this stimuli or the other, but yeah, not always when we want it. And now comes the challenge, because I told you at the beginning I define consciousness as subjective experience. But, well, non-communicative patients cannot provide report of their experience, so how I would know if they are conscious or not? And there are different approaches to that. So I would say this is the risky one, but very much developed so far, which is to state that take consciousness as the ability to perform certain cognitive function. And here there are active and passive paradigms in neuroimaging. The classical one is Owen's task, when patients were asked, imagine to play tennis, imagine to navigate through a room, and their brain response was about to differ much for these two tasks. And actually, the unresponsive patient was able to respond in the scanner for that. But the fact is that not all patients are able to respond in the scanner. So negative response does not exclude that they still may be conscious. So there are also passive paradigms. And here we have responses to specific sensory stimuli, for example, patient own name is very widely used. But also for many of those, we are unsure if some responses are not automatic, right? Okay, so what else can we do? Taking consciousness as subjective report, we can also infer from other populations that carefully access subjective reports. So this is, for example, that we use in the lab as well, serial awakenings from sleep. And this is also what led me to transfer from the OC study that I did for my PhD into what I'm doing now. So it's a studying of epileptic seizures. And I started it with Julie O'Tonnelly and Melanie Boley at UW, basically because I learned that for epileptic seizures, patients can come into kind of reversible state of unresponsive or unconsciousness. And what I mean by this, they might be not able to provide response, still being conscious, so right after the epileptic seizure, they can report about their state. And that's exactly what I've done. So I compared the groups of patients who were unconscious unresponsive, conscious unresponsive, and conscious responsive, revealing that slow wave activity for both unresponsive groups, if you can see here, slow wave activity increased in frontal cortex for those, while for unconscious group, slow wave activity increase in temporal parietal cortex, showing that there are two distinct phenomena. Okay, what else we do with when we study epileptic seizures? We also have like behavioral scale to differentiate seizure types, and there are like tonic-clonic and impaired consciousness seizure when consciousness is impaired, and like preserved conscious seizure when it's about to be preserved. And like recently I was able to use microelectrodes. So like with the macroelectrode going into the brain, that's like surgical procedure. At the very tip of this electrode, there are micro wires, and they allow to like study neuronal firings. And so I was having this microelectrodes placed either in seizure onset zone or outside, which led us to reveal that for the contacts in seizure onset zone, there is like the pattern of like increase and decrease in the firing rate. However, outside seizure onset zone, for the seizures with impaired consciousness, so like for these groups, there is increase, likely suggesting that it's like projecting to other areas, and there are different networks involved, which is what I'm studying further. And those are the people who contributed to this work. And I was also like mentioning at the beginning slow wave activity. So just to say in few words why. Okay, so previous studies revealed that slow wave activity is like associated with loss of consciousness during sleep, during anesthesia, and probably this, no. How do I stop this? And I wanted to say that also in vegetative state. It was also shown actually in epilepsy. And that's why we compare seizures to sleep, revealing here that for focal impaired seizures, so for seizures with impaired consciousness, they resemble light sleep in dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, while the same seizure type resembles deep sleep in temporal parietal cortex, also suggesting different associated mechanisms. And those are the people who contributed to this work. So to sum up my talk, we can infer about neuronal correlates of consciousness from various states. But like when comparing different states, so for example, when we compare like wakefulness to like coma and UWS, like how it was done in this work, we are actually unsure that like this state transition, which is whether it involves only consciousness or also like processes involved in this transition. So it might be actually better to study like things in within state contrast when you compare within the same physiological state. But when we do that and take only patients with disorders of consciousness which have diagnosis based on behavior, well, maybe it's also not the best. Maybe we should actually keep one category constant and combine within UWS only. Another point is that for studying neuronal correlates of consciousness in clinical population, I would say it is still important to have a theory in order to predict what brain signatures we would expect. Of course, we cannot take it for granted too much, as always, but it's important. And there are some markers that were developed based on theories, based on GNW. There was global local paradigm. It was a little bit challenged with P3B response. There is perturbational complexity index derived from IIT with transcranial magnetic stimulation, which was verified so far. And I just want to mention that we are currently doing the validation of this marker in the ICU, so it is something to also come and verify it more. And overall, I can say that we can validate neuronal correlates on different states when report is available, But we need to remember to distinguish between responsiveness, connectedness, and consciousness, as I mentioned at the very beginning. And also, like, clinical populations are highly heterogeneous. So it adds a little bit to this complexity. I would like to thank here the whole Cogitate consortium. So as you can see, that's a lot of people throughout the world who contributed to this work. And I also would like to thank my current lab at UW-Madison, our funding agencies, and another labs that I'm collaborating with. And with this beautiful picture of UW-Madison campus, thank you for your attention.